RomCalms, where romance and relaxation meet. Subscribe for a new romance novella every week. Lessons in Love, presented by RomCalms. Chapter 1. As Lillian stepped off the carriage, she found herself standing on cobbled stones that led to an imposing facade. The manor was more massive than any edifice she had encountered before. Its intimidating size made her feel small and insignificant, but she held her chin up high as she approached the doors. A stout woman with pursed lips and greying hair met her at the entrance. Mrs. Beasley, the housekeeper, welcomed Lillian with a curt nod. She wore a stern expression that seemed etched into lines on her face by years of service in the aristocratic household. Mrs. Beasley conducted Lillian around the manor with military precision and brisk efficiency. There were endless rooms filled with antique furniture polished to perfection, long corridors adorned with oil paintings of Duke Nicholas's ancestors, libraries bursting at seams with leather-bound books, ballrooms echoing past celebrations, and manicured gardens stretching as far as eyes could see. As they walked through vast hallways and winding staircases under vaulted ceilings, painted with cherubs and scenes from mythology, Mrs. Beasley laid out Lillian's duties in stark detail. "You will attend to their lessons promptly at 9 each morning," Mrs. Beasley said crisply, as they traversed through a corridor adorned with portraits of stern-looking men in military attire and women dressed in fineries from another era. "And you'll ensure their bedtime is adhered to strictly," she continued without pausing for breath, or considering if Lillian was keeping up, both with her pace and the litany of responsibilities. Lillian nodded diligently, absorbing every detail. She was not just any servant, she was a governess. Her role meant she was in charge of educating Duke Nicholas's children, shaping their young minds, and ensuring they grew to be well-mannered adults, ready for the societal circles they were born into. The day wore on as she was familiarized with her duties. The sun began to descend slowly over the horizon, casting shadows across the manor's stone walls. As Lillian walked through the beautifully manicured gardens towards what would be her new quarters, she could feel an uneasy knot form in her stomach. Despite its opulence and grandeur that threatened to overwhelm her senses at every turn, there was an undercurrent of loneliness that ran deep within these walls. She sighed softly, gazing around at the sprawling grounds bathed in dusky hues from the setting sun. As night fell upon the manor and stars began to twinkle high above in a velvet sky, Lillian lay wide awake on her bed, staring blankly at elegantly carved ceiling beams above. She had arrived at this grand manor as a beacon of hope for the children's future education. However, now she felt like a small boat caught in a tumultuous sea, trying to stay afloat amidst these overwhelming expectations. The second day at the manor began with a burst of light streaming through the ornate windows of Lillian's room. The early morning bustle filtered in through her door, stirring her from sleep. She arose from the comfortable confines of her feathered bed and prepared herself for the day. Her first encounter with Duke Nicholas's children was more chaotic than she had anticipated. The boys, Rupert and Edmund, were rambunctious twins, their golden hair unruly, eyes sparkling with mischief. They greeted Lillian with whooping laughter that echoed throughout the high-ceilinged library where lessons were to be conducted. The girl, sweet little Amelia, stood behind her brothers, shyly peeping out at Lillian from behind a curtain of soft brown curls. Her big blue eyes held a hint of apprehension as she clutched onto the skirt of her dress tightly. As Lillian tried to engage them in conversation and understand their academic levels, she faced resistance. Rupert and Edmund pulled pranks on her, while Amelia simply retreated further into her shell. Despite this daunting start, Lillian persevered. She cajoled and disciplined when necessary, holding firm amidst the stormy sea that was Duke Nicholas's progeny. She knew well enough that winning these young hearts would be a task requiring patience. Days rolled into weeks as she endured small pebbles flying during lessons and inkwells toppling mysteriously onto freshly pressed dresses. But gradually, the children started responding to her gentle yet firm demeanour. Amidst all the chaos and gradual order building up in his household's daily routine, Duke Nicholas remained an aloof figure, often seen but rarely heard by Lillian. He was a towering presence, dressed impeccably in tailored suits. His face always wore an unreadable expression that was both intriguing and intimidating. His deep-set eyes held a world of sorrow, the kind that comes from losing someone dear. Lillian often found him observing her silently from the corner of his eye when they crossed paths in the manor, but he never spoke more than necessary. She wondered what thoughts ran behind those intense eyes, but dared not ask. One evening, as Lillian was walking back to her quarters after a tiring day filled with lessons and playful banter with children, she noticed Duke Nicholas standing by an arched window overlooking the gardens. He seemed lost in thought as he gazed outside at the setting sun painting the vast sky in hues of gold and crimson. Lillian hesitated for a moment before gathering courage to approach him. "Your children are bright, my Grace," she began tentatively, breaking the silence that hung between them like a thick veil. Duke Nicholas turned towards her slowly. His gaze was distant, yet piercing as it met hers. "They were raised well, raised by a bright woman," he said curtly, before turning away without waiting for her response. He then moved away, leaving Lillian standing alone in the long corridor, with nothing but echoes of his cold voice. As the days passed, Lillian found herself growing accustomed to the rhythm of life within the manor. The initial chaos of settling into her new role began to give way to a routine of sorts. Her mornings were spent in the library with Duke Nicholas's children, engrossed in lessons that ranged from history and literature to art and languages. Rupert and Edmund, although mischievous at times, began to respect her authority. Their laughter still echoed through the library walls, but it was no longer at her expense. Instead, it was often in response to a clever story or interesting fact she shared during lessons. Amelia remained shy, but gradually started opening up under Lillian's patient guidance. Her big blue eyes would light up when they discussed fairy tales, and she seemed particularly interested in music. Afternoons were devoted to etiquette training and outdoor activities that kept them active, while evenings were reserved for reading sessions by the fireplace in the drawing room, where they listened enraptured as Lillian spun tales of gallant knights and far-off lands. One evening, when a thunderstorm had confined everyone indoors, the children were huddled around Lillian on a plush sofa near the fireplace, listening attentively as she read out aloud from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Duke Nicholas walked into the room unexpectedly, just as she was mimicking Cheshire Cat's sly voice, causing peals of laughter among children. He paused by doorway, watching them unnoticed. His eyes lingered on Lillian, whose face was animated with excitement as she brought characters to life. After the reading session, Lillian noticed him standing by the doorway. She looked up from the book and met his gaze. The usual coldness in his eyes had given way to something different, a hint of warmth. He nodded at her, a silent acknowledgement, before turning on his heel and leaving. Chapter 2. Lillian had adapted well to her new environment, but was still finding it challenging to fill the shoes of a figure she had never met, the late Duchess. Her presence pervaded every corner of the manor, from the grand portraits adorning its walls to the subtle whispers among staff members. One evening after dinner, as Lillian took her usual walk along the corridors lined with portraits of past dukes and duchesses, she halted before one that captured her attention. It was an oil painting of a woman with striking azure eyes that mirrored deep wisdom and kindness, adorned in a luxurious velvet dress. The inscription below read, "Duchess Victoria." Lillian observed her portrait intently. She tried to discern what kind of woman Victoria had been. What made her so dearly missed by all that knew her? Intrigued by this enigma, Lillian decided to address this topic delicately with Nicholas's children during their lessons. As they sat around a large mahogany table engrossed in their history books, Lillian mustered up courage and asked them about their late mother. Their faces lit up instantly. Rupert spoke first, his voice filled with admiration. "Mummy would take me and Edmund on hunts around the estate. Hunts for monsters and bugs and magical creatures and all sorts of things." Amelia's voice quavered slightly as she spoke. "Mummy used to sing lullabies to me every night before bed." Their stories painted an image of an angelic figure who seemed almost impossible for any mortal being to emulate. Lillian listened with rapt attention, yet felt a twinge of inadequacy within herself. That night, Lillian wondered how she could make this transition on the children easier. She knew that she could never replace Victoria in their lives, but perhaps she could try to heal some of the wounds left by her departure. She decided to bring more joy into this sorrow-filled manor, even if it meant walking on a path laid by someone else. The days that followed saw Lillian trying to emulate Victoria's mannerisms based on what the children had shared. From singing lullabies to Amelia before bedtime, to engaging Rupert and Edmund in adventurous treasure hunts across the estate, Lillian tried it all. However, her efforts seemed more like caricatures rather than genuine actions. The children became upset. They felt as though it was a cheap imitation of the woman they loved. "You're not Mummy," Amelia said under her breath. That evening, after a failed attempt at recreating Victoria's famed cucumber sandwiches for afternoon tea, Lillian found herself sitting alone in the kitchen with remnants of sliced cucumbers and bread scattered around her. Tears welled up in her eyes as feelings of failure weighed heavily upon her heart. The following day, Lillian decided on a different approach. Instead of imitating what had been, she would create new memories for them, making each moment unique and special. She began by turning their routine lessons into interactive sessions filled with games from her own childhood. She introduced Rupert and Edmund to Knucklebones, a game she had played with pebbles as a child in her modest village, much less grand than their ivory pieces, but just as enjoyable. Amelia was taught how to weave daisy chains. Lillian showed her how to carefully thread each flower through the other until they created a ring of sunshine that sat beautifully atop Amelia's golden curls. As days passed, laughter returned to the manor halls and slowly seeped into Duke Nicholas's heart. He found himself drawn towards the sounds of happiness that echoed from his children's study room, sounds he hadn't heard since Victoria's passing. One afternoon, urged by curiosity and an inexplicable need for companionship, he joined them during their creative learning session. That day's topic was Greek mythology. Lillian narrated tales of heroic deeds and tragic love stories with such passion that even Nicholas found himself hanging on to every word, as if hearing these stories for the first time. Over dinner that evening, under the warm glow of chandeliers and amidst clinking silverware against fine china dishes, Nicholas initiated conversation about Greek myths with his children, something he hadn't done in years. They excitedly shared what they learned from Lillian earlier that day, retelling tales of gods, goddesses, and mythical creatures. Lillian watched from the corner of the room, a surge of joy filling her heart as she witnessed the bond between father and children strengthening. She found herself sharing a secret smile with Nicholas across the dining table, a good sign that they were making progress. Chapter 3. With each passing moment, Lillian found herself growing more accustomed to her role as the governess. The stern countenance of Mrs. Beasley had softened somewhat, replaced by a grudging respect for the young woman's dedication to her charges. Lillian's initial attempts at winning over Nicholas's children, Rupert, Edmund, and Amelia, were met with resistance. She was an outsider in their world of nobility and privilege, but her patience didn't waver. She remained firm yet gentle in her approach. One afternoon, as a light drizzle tapped rhythmically against the window panes of the manor library, Lillian quickly decided on a new game. With an adventurous glint in her eyes, she transformed their lessons into an interactive game. "Imagine we're explorers," she said excitedly to the children who were looking at her with wide-eyed curiosity. "And these books are our treasure chests, filled with stories from different worlds." Rupert and Edmund started participating enthusiastically, while Amelia gradually came out of her shell. "And I am the great explorer, Rupert the Wise." Rupert stood on a stool and declared. Their laughter echoed through the silent corridors of the manor that had not known such joy in some time. "Supper is ready," Mrs. Beasley said stoically from the entryway. At supper, Amelia asked Nicholas about his favourite book, and he found himself sharing stories from his childhood. "My favourite stories were those of action and adventure," the Duke said with a smile. "Really?" the three children asked in disbelief. "I wasn't always this stiff old man, you know." Nicholas laughed. "I was a rambunctious little boy, just like you two." He pointed to Rupert and Edmund. Lillian listened attentively to him narrating tales of his youthful escapades and dreams, his fears and ambitions. It was a pleasant change of pace for all of them. In the weeks that followed, Duke Nicholas found himself increasingly drawn into Lillian's lively world. Their shared meals together became more frequent, a routine that was as comforting as it was unexpected. Over bowls of soup and platters of roasted meat, they found common ground in their love for literature and philosophy. One evening, they sat in the grand dining room, a fire crackling in the massive stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The children were well into their desserts, their faces smeared with remnants of raspberry jam and cream. "Miss Lillian," began Amelia hesitantly, her small voice barely audible over Rupert and Edmund's playful banter. "What is your favourite story?" "I believe every book has its charm," Lillian replied thoughtfully, pausing to wipe a stray smear of cream from Amelia's cheek. "But if I had to choose one, it would be Jane Eyre." "Do you know why?" Amelia shook her head, her curious eyes fixed on Lillian. "The heroine Jane is not a lady of high birth or great beauty," she explained gently. "Yet she possesses a strong spirit and independence that sets her apart." Lillian's gaze met Nicholas's across the table. His deep-set eyes reflected an unspoken admiration that took her by surprise. "Your Grace," Lillian began, "how about you? I don't think you ever told us your favourite tale from the other night." Nicholas swallowed his bite of food before clearing his throat and said softly, "The Odyssey, perhaps." "The Greek mythology?" questioned Lillian curiously. "Yes," he affirmed with an almost nostalgic smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I always admired Odysseus's courage and determination to return home against all odds." The conversation flowed effortlessly from that point onwards. Laughter interspersed with thoughtful silences, creating an atmosphere brimming with camaraderie and warmth. In the quiet of his study later that night, Nicholas found himself reflecting on their conversation at dinner. He realized that in these shared moments with Lillian, he was not just a duke carrying the weight of an aristocratic lineage, but a man rediscovering simple pleasures of companionship and intellectual stimulation. He began to see Lillian not just as the governess who had brought joy back into his children's lives, but perhaps brought some joy into his life as well. She was the melody that brought life back into his silent symphony, filling empty spaces he didn't realize existed until she stepped in. Nicholas found himself captivated by her aura. Her laughter became the music his heart yearned for. Her wit sparked conversations that made him feel alive again. He admired how she navigated through life's complexities with a contagious optimism, despite being placed in a world far removed from her own. Yet beneath this growing bond lay unexplored territories of emotions that both hesitated to acknowledge, a subtle chemistry brewing between stolen glances and shared smiles. The Duke sat by his study window, watching as the twilight stars began to twinkle into existence. His thoughts were not on the day's affairs or his responsibilities as a duke for once. They were occupied by someone who had unexpectedly become a welcomed presence in his life. His musings were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was Lillian standing at the entrance. She looked slightly apprehensive yet determined. "Duke Nicholas," she began, "I wanted to talk to you about Amelia." Nicholas gestured for her to come in and take a seat across from him at his mahogany desk. His heart pounded slightly faster than usual as he awaited what she had to say. "I've noticed," Lillian started slowly, "that Amelia has been struggling with reading." Nicholas felt a pang of disappointment wash over him. He hadn't noticed this struggle amidst all his responsibilities. However, looking at Lillian's determined expression gave him hope. Here was someone willing to help where he couldn't. "I believe," she continued, "that we could find a way to make reading more accessible for her. Perhaps we could try out different teaching strategies suited to her learning style." Nicholas felt a surge of gratitude towards Lillian, as he knew she genuinely cared for his children's growth. "Thank you, Miss Hargrove," he said sincerely. "I appreciate your dedication and hard work. I trust you'll do your best for Amelia." Her face broke into a smile at his words, a radiant, heartwarming smile that made him realize how much he yearned to see it every day. "I will, Your Grace." She paused slightly before adding, "And please, call me Lillian." He nodded, feeling an unfamiliar warmth spread through him. "Lillian," he repeated softly. She rose from the chair and walked towards the door. As she reached the entrance, she turned back to look at him. There was an unspoken understanding in her gaze that made his breath hitch. "Good night, Nicholas." Chapter 4. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Lillian's chamber, illuminating the room with a warm glow. She sat at her vanity, brushing her hair absent-mindedly as she gazed into the mirror. But her reflection betrayed a troubled countenance. Her mind was filled with a chaos of thoughts, all centered on Duke Nicholas and the unusual closeness that had developed between them. Lillian had always been an astute observer who prided herself on maintaining objectivity in all situations. Yet when it came to Duke Nicholas, her rationality seemed to crumble, replaced by a whirlwind of emotions she could barely comprehend. Every time she felt herself getting closer to him emotionally, reality intervened like an unwelcome guest, reminding her of her vastly different upbringing than his. Their relationship was not one between equals, but that of a master and governess. It was doomed from the start. Across the vast manor in his study sat Duke Nicholas, fighting against similar emotions. He found himself increasingly drawn towards Lillian's wit and wisdom that set her apart from other women he knew. Her laughter echoed in his ears long after she'd left his presence, bringing much-needed warmth to his cold existence. Nicholas couldn't help but admire how effortlessly Lillian managed to bring joy back into his children's lives, something he had failed miserably at since Victoria's demise. He loved watching Lillian during their lessons. Her eyes sparkled with intelligence. There was an infectious excitement about learning that she had managed to instill in his children. But with these pleasant thoughts came the prickling sense of guilt. He was a widower, bound by the memory of his late wife, who was still adored throughout the manor. Could he really allow himself to feel this way about another woman? And if he did, would it be seen as betrayal? Nicholas glanced at Victoria's portrait hanging on the wall opposite him. Her gentle smile seemed to mock his turmoil. He missed her every day, but life had moved on without her, and so had he. The Duke sighed deeply as he rested back in his chair, rubbing his temples in frustration. His emotions were at war with one another. A part of him yearned for Lillian, while another part clung tightly to Victoria's memories. Chapter 5. The grand manor of Duke Nicholas was abuzz with anticipation. Preparations for the upcoming gala were in full swing, transforming the usually calm estate into a hive of activity. Servants rushed to and fro, their arms laden with lavish decorations that glittered under the chandelier's soft glow. Lillian watched this commotion from the sidelines, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and anxiety. Her duties as a governess had taken on an added dimension with the upcoming event. Not only did she have to ensure that Rupert, Edmund, and Amelia were well prepared for their roles as gracious hosts, but also that they looked impeccable in their new clothing. As she helped Amelia lace up her pretty silk dress, Lillian couldn't help but feel a pang of self-consciousness about her own attire. She had been so consumed by her responsibilities around the children's education and well-being that she hadn't given much thought to what she would wear at such a grand occasion. Her wardrobe consisted mostly of plain dresses suitable for teaching or fussing over energetic children, not gowns fit for a gala. "Miss Lillian?" The voice belonged to Mrs. Beasley, who carried a shimmering gown draped delicately over one arm. Lillian turned around and gasped at the sight before her eyes. A stunning gown made of rich velvet, hued like twilight itself. Deep blue speckled with tiny crystals that sparkled like stars against an evening sky. "His Grace requests that you wear this tonight," said Mrs. Beasley cryptically, before turning on her heel and leaving. Lillian was left alone in the room, clutching the beautiful gown, wondering what Duke Nicholas intended by this gesture. His kindness stirred something in Lillian. It went beyond gratitude. It was another sign of his growing affection towards her. As she slipped into the gown later that evening, she couldn't help but think of how Duke Nicholas would react when he saw her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she anticipated the night ahead. The prospect of spending an evening amidst the aristocracy was intimidating, and yet the thought of catching Duke Nicholas's eye filled her with a sense of excitement she hadn't felt before. The grand ballroom was shining in all its splendor when Lillian entered. She could hear the soft murmurings of conversation, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the gentle strains of a waltz being played by musicians tucked away in one corner. She scanned the room for a familiar face and found Duke Nicholas standing at a distance. He was deep in conversation with another gentleman, but his gaze wandered until it fell on Lillian. His eyes widened slightly as he took her in, dressed not like a governess, but like a lady attending a gala. Their eyes locked for what seemed an eternity before Nicholas excused himself from his conversation and made his way towards Lillian. A warm smile spread across his face as he reached her side. "You look exquisite tonight," he said softly. Lillian blushed under his intense gaze. "Thank you, Your Grace." As the gala moved into full swing, the grand ballroom was alive with laughter and music. Lillian watched as men and women spun around in a lively waltz, their colourful gowns billowing out like blossoms in a spring breeze. She felt an exhilarating rush of happiness that she hadn't felt in a long time. Nicholas led her across the dance floor, the lights from the chandeliers casting a warm glow on his handsome features. "Would you care to dance?" he asked, extending his hand towards her. The question hung in the air between them like an unspoken confession of their mutual attraction. Lillian hesitated for a moment, but then placed her hand in his, looking up into his eyes with a shy smile. "I would be delighted, Your Grace." As they glided gracefully across the floor, Lillian couldn't help but notice how right it felt to be held by him. His touch was gentle, yet firm. His gaze was intense, yet tender. It was as if all her fears about fitting into this new world had melted away under Nicholas's gentle guidance. "Are you enjoying yourself?" Nicholas asked as they swayed to the rhythm of the music. Lillian nodded, unable to articulate her feelings verbally. "Yes," she finally managed to whisper back, meeting his gaze with an intensity equaling his own. The dance ended too soon for Lillian's liking, leaving them amidst applause from their spectators. As they shared dinner afterward among other esteemed guests on their table, Duke Nicholas and Lillian engaged in stimulating conversations with their peers. After dinner, Nicholas led her onto the terrace away from the crowd, under the soft glow of moonlight. The garden was bathed in silver light, casting long shadows that danced with their heartbeats. "Lillian," Nicholas began, his voice low and sincere, "you truly do look beautiful tonight." His words hung heavily between them, like a secret unveiled. Lillian looked up at him, feeling a whirlwind of emotions welling up within her. Was it possible? Could Duke Nicholas truly harbour feelings for her? "Your Grace," she whispered hesitantly. "I mean it, Lillian," Nicholas interjected firmly, capturing her gaze with an intensity that left her breathless. "I have been a widower lost in sorrow, until you brought life back into this manor, into my children's lives, into my life," he confessed earnestly. Before Lillian could respond, he leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't object, he gently pressed his lips against hers under the twinkling stars. The kiss was soft and tender, a confession of hidden desires, a promise of something beautiful yet to unfold between them. It was as if all the unspoken words and suppressed feelings had found an outlet in that one intimate moment they shared under the starlit Victorian sky. Chapter 6. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when Lillian was summoned to Duke Nicholas's study. The manor was still drowsy, caught in the silence of a new day. Her heart thudded in her chest as she knocked on the massive oak door, unsure of what awaited her inside. Nicholas was seated behind his grand desk, his features etched with seriousness that made her stomach knot with uncertainty. He looked up from the parchment he had been studying, his deep-set eyes meeting hers. "Lillian," he began, his voice echoing off the ornate walls of his study. "Please have a seat." Lillian complied silently, settling into a plush chair across from him. She folded her hands neatly in her lap, waiting for him to speak again. She noticed how different this room felt in daylight compared to last night's soft moonlit ambience. "Lillian," Nicholas repeated after a long pause, rubbing his temples wearily, "I find myself at a loss as to how best to navigate our situation." His frank admission took her aback, and she blinked at him nervously, her pulse quickening. The morning sunlight filtering through the tall windows cast an ethereal glow around him, making him look more divine yet human than ever before. "What are your intentions towards me?" His voice held no accusation, but it brought forth all those feelings she had been struggling to keep at bay. "I should ask you the very same question, Your Grace," she replied evenly, but inwardly recoiled at using formalities now, when they were discussing something so personal. He frowned slightly at her response, but didn't comment on it. Instead, he asked another question that threw Lillian off guard completely. "Do you genuinely care for me?" She felt an instant pang of hurt by his implication and retorted defensively, "Yes, I do." "This isn't just a fondness from circumstance, perhaps from opportunity?" he asked carefully. "How dare you?" she said, hurt by his words. "And what of you? Are you not just swooning over the first woman you meet since—" She stopped herself. They stared at each other in silence, the tension in the room palpable. The morning light had grown brighter now, but both of them were caught in a storm of their making, a whirlwind of suppressed emotions, fear, doubt, love, and regret. "I'm sorry," she said softly. The Duke hung his head in silence. "As am I." He waited a moment before speaking. "This is a delicate situation for both of us. It's natural for fears to arise." Lillian responded sincerely, meeting his gaze steadily. "I know we are treading on delicate grounds here, but—" She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing with renewed determination. "But we can see this through." He looked at her with surprise, then slowly his features relaxed into a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes, making them shine with unspoken joy and relief. "Yes," he agreed, nodding seriously. "We can." Chapter 7. The morning after their heartfelt confession, Duke Nicholas called for a meeting of his household staff. The servants gathered in the grand hall, curious about the impromptu assembly. Lillian stood by his side, her heart fluttering like a hummingbird's wings against her chest. "Everyone," Nicholas began, his voice echoing through the vast room, "I have an announcement to make." His eyes softened as they found Lillian's. "Miss Hargrove and I are together." Murmurs of surprise rippled through the crowd. Wide eyes turned to Lillian, who wore a small but genuine smile as she met their gazes. "I am fully aware that this is quite unconventional," Nicholas continued, "and I understand if it might take time for some of you to accept it, but I hope you can see how much happiness Miss Hargrove has brought into our lives since she arrived here." He looked at Lillian again, a warmth lighting up his icy blue eyes that had been absent ever since Victoria passed away. It was clear that he meant every word he said. He truly loved Lillian, and wasn't afraid to admit it anymore. The room was silent for a moment, before Mrs. Beasley stepped forward from the group. The stern housekeeper had worked for Nicholas for many years, and held his respect and trust. "Duke Nicholas," she started with her usual firm tone, "if Miss Hargrove makes you happy after all this time of suffering, we are nothing but welcoming." She paused before adding with a smirk, "Besides, haven't we all noticed how you've been looking at each other?" Laughter echoed around the grand hall, warm and comforting like an old friend visiting after years apart. The tension melted away as more members of the household staff stepped forward, offering their congratulations and well wishes to Nicholas and Lillian. Lillian was overwhelmed by the reaction. She blinked away tears of relief and joy. She had feared that their relationship would be met with resistance, but instead they were welcomed with open arms. And though some hesitated initially, even the most hard-hearted among them couldn't resist the love that was evidently blossoming between Lillian and Duke Nicholas. After meeting with the staff, Lillian prepared herself for another important conversation. This time, it was with the children. As breakfast drew near, Lillian assembled the children in the garden, where sunlight filtered through tall trees, creating dancing shadows on the ground beneath. The atmosphere was peaceful, but held an undertone of anxiety that mirrored Lillian's apprehension over their reaction. "I have something important to discuss with you," their father began hesitantly. The children looked at him curiously, but remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "Miss Lillian and I we're in love." Rupert and Edmund traded glances before looking back at Lillian, their expressions a mix of surprise and confusion. Amelia, however, remained quiet, but her eyes reflected understanding beyond her years. "I know this is sudden," Lillian rushed to add, "and I understand if you need time to process it. But please remember that I adore each one of you dearly, and nothing will change that." There was silence for a moment, before Rupert finally spoke up. "Does this mean you're staying with us forever?" His voice wavered slightly, revealing hidden fear behind his question. "If it pleases you all and the Duke, then yes," Lillian said gently. "Hooray!" the children exclaimed, and all jumped on Lillian for a group hug. The Duke laughed. "So you're happy then?" "The happiest I've been in so long," Amelia said. "As am I," Duke Nicholas returned with a smile.